one day. He goes, it's just...
She just stood there looking with that mixture of concern and understanding on her face. After so many years, she knew how things work. Be careful. She said, her voice firm, but with a touch of fear that she always tried to hide. I knelt down to talk to my children, who were now quiet looking at me with those big, curious eyes. Daddy needs to go out to put out a fire. I explained, forcing a smile, that I didn't feel be good to Mommy. Okay, they nodded, but their expression broke me inside. It's always hard to come out like that, knowing that they still don't fully understand what that means. I gave each one a kiss, grabbed my keys, and left on the way to the station. The city looked different. The streets were strangely empty, but the sky revealed what was happening. An orange glow colored the horizon, and the smell of smoke was already beginning to invade the car. Even after years, that smell always makes me wonder how many lives will be affected this time. How many can we save? When I arrived at the station, chaos had already ensued. Trucks left in line, firefighters ran everywhere, getting equipped, receiving instructions, and trying to organize the operation. I had never seen anything like this, not even on my worst days. I barely entered when my supervisor came up to me, his face covered in soot and sweat. Put on your gear now, he ordered. We need every truck on that fire now. There was no time for questions or doubts. Within minutes, I was inside one of the few trucks still at the station, ready to face whatever was coming. But something in the look in my supervisor's eyes and the frantic rush around told me this wasn't just an ordinary fire. It was bigger, much bigger. On the way to the location, the silence inside the truck was suffocating. Nobody said anything, but they didn't need to. The glow on the horizon grew brighter with every kilometer, and the distant roar of the fire could already be heard. When we finally approached the line of fire, what we saw took what little breath we had left. The flames dominated everything. It was a monster devouring the city, spitting smoke and heat everywhere. The noise was deafening, as if the earth itself was screaming. Planes flew overhead, dropping water and retardant, but it was obvious that it wasn't working. The fire not only resisted, he seemed to grow, as if he were coming to life. I looked at my partner, who was gripping the door handle so hard his knuckles were white. This is worse than anything we've ever seen before, he muttered almost to himself. He was right. That wasn't normal, not by far. But at that moment, there was no time for questions. There was no room for fear. There was only work we needed to do. When we got out of the truck, the heat hit us like a wave. No matter how many times you face it, you never get used to it. Fire is not just hot, it is oppressive, suffocating. The smoke mixed with the air seems to crush you before you even take the first step. The noise was also something that got to me. The sound of fire roaring through the hills, mixed with the screams of people and the desperate barking of dogs, was something that could only be described as a nightmare. As we moved into the line of fire, I realized something was very wrong. Typically, fires have a pattern of logic. You can see how they spread, predict their next move, find a way to control them. But this one was different. The flames seemed to be everywhere. Once they weren't just burning, they were consuming. It was as if the fire was being guided deliberately to engulf everything in front of it. My partner, who was normally the calmest and most focused on the team, turned to me and said something that only made my discomfort worse. This doesn't feel right. It seems planned. I shook my head, trying to shake the thought away, but it stuck to me like soot in the air. He was right. The speed, the intensity, the path the fire took, none of it made sense. As we worked, the chaos around us was almost uncontrollable. People ran with their faces frozen in panic, some holding children, others just running away with what they could carry. Animals instinctively seeking safety rushed through the smoke, their silhouettes appearing and disappearing like ghosts. It was a scene that could be in a disaster movie, but there was no director, no script. It was real. With each passing minute, it became clearer that we were losing the battle. The fire was winning, and we didn't have enough resources to stop it. Planes and helicopters passed overhead, dropping water and retardant, but it was like trying to put out a fire by throwing raindrops. The ferocity of the flames did not diminish. On the contrary, it seemed like they were getting stronger. After hours of incessant work, I managed to take a moment to breathe. I looked around and saw the devastation the fire had already caused. Houses were reduced to smoking skeletons, cars were melted to the core, and what were once neighborhoods were now nothing more than piles of ash. That orange pulsating glow of fire reflected in the sky like an open wound in the night. It was at that moment that I thought again about my partner's words. This was planned, as absurd as it seemed. The idea wouldn't leave my head. As a firefighter, you learn to recognize the signs where the fire started, how it spreads, what fuels it, and nothing there seemed natural. Everything was too fast, too destructive, too precise. As I prepared to return to the fight, my partner approached, his face covered in soot, but With a grave expression I had never seen before. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice low almost, as if he was afraid of being overheard. This didn't start alone. "I think someone did this." I was speechless for a moment. "Are you crazy? No one would be able to do something like that." "I know it sounds crazy," he replied, "but listen, this is not natural. Something is very wrong here. I'll tell you more later." I didn't know what to think. There was no time to argue. And honestly, the idea seemed so absurd that I didn't want to pay attention. But the seed was planted. And as we continued to fight, that monster doubt grew within me. If he was right, who would do something like that? And why, after hours of fighting that inferno, we finally managed to contain part of the fire, not erase it, of course, but gain some control. It was a small, almost insignificant victory, but it was enough to give us a moment to pause. I sat on the ground, exhausted, feeling the heat still radiating from the ash around me. My body hurt, my head throbbed. But my mind wouldn't stop. My partner's words stuck in my head. This was planned. As I looked at what was left of the neighborhood we were trying to save, I began to wonder, what did he mean? Why did you think that? And more importantly, was he right? He came to me still looking serious. But this time there was something more, something that seemed like a weight and urgency. "Now we can talk," he said, lowering his voice so that no one else could hear. "I didn't want to tell you in the middle of the chaos, but I think you need to know." I stared at him, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. He hesitated for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to continue. Then finally he spoke. "I heard a conversation," he began, "at the station a few days ago. Our manager was talking to two guys I had never seen before. They were in the office, but the door was half open, and I heard part of what they were saying. They mentioned something about evidence and how fire would solve everything. At the time I thought I had misunderstood, but now after seeing this, it doesn't seem like a coincidence." I was paralyzed. I tried to process what he was saying, but my mind refused to accept it. "Wait," I said, trying to find the words. "Are you telling me that the fire was set on purpose? Why? Who would do that?" He shrugged, his expression heavy. "I don't know, but the way the fire started, the place where it started, the speed, none of it makes sense. I've seen a lot of fires in my life, but this one is different." I wanted to believe he was wrong, that this was just exhaustion talking, or maybe a misunderstanding, but something inside me began to stir. I couldn't ignore the facts. The fire was spreading too quickly, too precisely, and the resources we had seemed insufficient from the start. "If that's true," I said, my voice lower now, "whoever did this doesn't care at all, not with the lives lost, nor with the houses destroyed. Nothing." He nodded, and for a moment we were silent, just staring at the flames in the distance. The truth was, even without concrete evidence, what he said made sense. I myself knew something was wrong, but I never imagined it could be something so calculated. What disturbed me most was the why. Who would do something like that? What would be the objective? Because if anyone had the courage to cause this kind of destruction, they weren't kidding. They were after something big, something that justified putting so many lives at risk. Still, there was no time to reflect too much. The truck's siren sounded, calling us back to work. I got up, taking a deep breath, and followed my partner to the next battle line. But as I walked, his words echoed in my mind, and for the first time in 30 years of service, I felt something I had never felt before on a mission: distrust, not in the fire, not in the unpredictable nature of my work, but in the people around me, and that somehow was scarier than any fire I had ever faced. After a whole night fighting that monster, we returned to the station with our bodies exhausted and our minds heavy. The silence inside the truck was almost deafening, as if no one wanted to be the first to speak. I looked out the window at the landscape, seeing the hills still smoking, and felt overcome by a mixture of tiredness and restlessness. When we finally arrived, the place seemed empty. Almost all the teams were still on the field, and the few that had returned were as finished as we were. I threw myself onto one of the locker room benches, letting out a heavy sigh. But my mind wouldn't rest. My partner's words, the images of the fire, the chaos we witnessed, everything was mixed together like a knot that was impossible to untie. As I took off my boots and wiped my face, my partner entered. He sat next to me, and for a moment we were silent, until he said, "Do you still think I'm crazy?" I looked at him. "I don't know what to think anymore," I admitted. "But what you said is starting to make sense." He nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. I said, "I would tell you more. So listen." During the conversation, I overheard they also mentioned something about having the perfect chance, and how time was on their side. I didn't understand everything, but it seemed like they were waiting for the right moment to act. And now everything seems to fall into place. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say he was exaggerating, but the more I thought, the more the pieces started to make sense. How quickly the fire spread, the manager's strange behavior, and now this information Something was definitely wrong. I decided to investigate on my own. I couldn't ignore what he had said, but I also couldn't just accuse someone without proof, so after returning home, I took a quick shower, kissed my wife and kids, and went straight to the computer. It was almost as if I needed to do this. Before the courage slipped away, I started looking for anything related to the fire. The headlines were the usual: devastating fire destroys Hollywood Hills. Thousands evacuated firefighters faces historic challenge. But when I went beyond the mainstream media and started delving into the stories of everyday people, blogs, small local news portals, even forums like Reddit, the stories started to change. There were witnesses saying they saw unmarked trucks near the area where the fire started a few hours earlier. Others mentioned equipment being unloaded at night in places that were now completely destroyed. One user described hearing a heated argument between two men in suits near a local cafe talking about speeding up the process. And then came the discovery that really shook me. A local journalist had published an article days before the fire detailing a fierce dispute between real estate developers and area residents. According to him, large companies had been trying to buy that land for years, but were blocked by regulations, legal disputes, and community resistance. The land was valuable, almost sacred, but now with the fire, all that was gone. Nothing stopped developers from moving forward anymore. I kept digging and found something even more disturbing. A zoning law was about to be voted on by the city council. This law would allow residential land to be converted into commercial and corporate areas, exactly the type of change that would benefit developers interested in the fire-ravaged region. My breathing became heavy. The coincidences were piling up, and they no longer seemed like coincidences. Everything was lined up in a way that was impossible to ignore. That voice in my head, the one that always alerted me when something was wrong, was screaming. Now I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. I didn't know exactly what to do with it all. On the one hand, there was no solid evidence, only reports and suspicions. On the other hand, it was not possible to ignore the pattern. Something was happening, something big, something that involved powerful interests and a total disregard for the lives that were being destroyed. What if it were true? If the fire had been caused on purpose, who would have had the courage to do something like that? And why money, power, destroy evidence? As my partner suggested, the questions were so many that my mind felt like it was about to explode. I looked at the clock. It was late. My family was already asleep. But I knew sleep wouldn't come to me, because now I had more than just suspicions. I had a feeling that was eating me up inside, the certainty that we were dealing with something much bigger than a simple fire. The next day I arrived at the station early.